On May 1st, 2022, a conflict that had once lived only in heated words and social media rants turned into something that could never be undone. In Montgomery, Alabama, 32-year-old Erica Reese found herself entangled in a bitter feud with a woman named Katina Davis. What began as rivalry over love and loyalty escalated into something far deadlier. Hours before tragedy struck, Erica picked up her phone, went live on Facebook, and spoke words that would echo through her community. She vowed to end her rival. It was a declaration heard by friends, strangers, and ultimately, her killer. This is not just another headline. This is a story of pride, jealousy, and a decision made in the heat of anger that cost a young woman her life. Erica's life ended on East Patton Avenue, where gunfire shattered the night and left her fatally struck, while two others were caught in the crossfire. That moment left a neighborhood in shock, a family broken, and a rival facing the weight of the law. Tonight we are not here to sensationalize. We are here to carefully retrace the steps of this tragedy, what led to it, what happened in those final moments, and how the echoes of this feud continue to haunt Montgomery. Because behind the flashing lights of police cars and the headlines splashed across news outlets lies a deeper truth about the dangers of jealousy, the consequences of threats, and the way social media can magnify conflict until it turns violent. Imagine hearing someone close to you declare war in public, dismissing every warning, ignoring every chance to step back. That was Erica's final broadcast. Her words gave voice to her rage, but they also sealed her fate. Hours later, those words would be answered with bullets. As we begin this story, keep in mind the lives touched by these events. Families forced to grieve, children left without a mother, and a community forced to confront the question, when does an argument stop being just words and start becoming a countdown to tragedy? This is the chilling story of Erica Reese, a young woman whose life was cut short not in silence, but in a storm of anger that the world was invited to watch. And this is also the story of Katina Davis, the woman accused of pulling the trigger after threats became action and rivalries turned fatal. If you're watching this right now, it means you value truth and awareness. Don't just scroll past. Hit subscribe so these lessons aren't forgotten. Imagine hearing about cases like this. Too late. Stay with me as we move deeper into the background of this case, into the lives of the women at the heart of this conflict, and into the moments that made May 1st, 2022, a day Montgomery will never forget. To understand what happened on May 1st, 2022, we must step back and look closely at the lives of the two women at the center of this conflict. Lives that would soon collide in the most devastating way possible. Erica Reese was 32 years old, a Montgomery native known for her outspoken nature and her strong personality. Friends described her as bold, unafraid to say what she felt, and deeply protective of the people she loved. But with that same fire came conflict. Erica's relationships had not been easy, and the one that would ultimately entangle her with Katina Davis was no different. At the center of it all was a love interest, a man whose presence created jealousy, suspicion, and hostility between the two women. Erica was no stranger to social media. In fact, Facebook was often her stage. She spoke her mind there, addressed her rivals directly, and sometimes broadcast her anger for hundreds of viewers to see. This was not unusual in her world. Social media had become the new battleground, a place where disputes were aired publicly instead of being settled privately. For Erica, this feud with Katina was not something to hide. It was something to put on display. Katina Davis, the woman on the other side of this feud, was also a figure known in Montgomery. She carried her own pride and her own resentment. Those who knew her said she was not one to back down when challenged. Like Erica, she had her own reasons to feel slighted, her own loyalty to protect, and her own anger to show. The tension between these two women had been simmering for weeks, fueled by jealousy and sharpened by insults exchanged both in person and online. Montgomery itself was no stranger to violence in 2022. The city, with its long history and deep cultural roots, was also facing struggles with crime, economic pressures, and the weight of modern conflicts carried out through screens and smartphones. On East Patton Avenue, where families lived and children played, the idea that a feud would end in bloodshed was shocking, but not entirely unimaginable. It was a neighborhood like many others, ordinary but with shadows that stretched far, when anger and pride mixed with violence. By the end of April, the situation between Erica and Katina had reached a boiling point. Erica, fueled by anger and convinced she needed to prove herself, went live on Facebook. In that broadcast, her voice carried defiance, her words aimed directly at Katina. She vowed to end her rival, a statement that was both a warning and a challenge. For those watching, it may have seemed like just another heated rant, the kind of thing people said online without meaning to act on. But for Erica and Katina, the lines between words and actions were quickly blurring. The choice to go public with such threats carried consequences Erica could never have imagined. By declaring war in front of an audience, she had removed the possibility of retreat. Pride would not allow either woman to back down. What might have remained an argument behind closed doors was now an open declaration that demanded a response. And so, the hours ticked away. On May 1st, the city moved forward as it always did. Families attended church services, children played in yards, and neighbors went about their routines. But beneath the surface, a confrontation was forming. East Patton Avenue would soon bear witness to a scene no one there would ever forget. This was no random act of violence. This was a collision of two lives, each unwilling to yield, each driven by emotions that had been laid bare for the world to see. The stage was set not in silence, but in the glare of a phone camera, the echo of words spoken in anger, and the weight of jealousy that had gone unchecked. The background of this case is not just about two women. It is about a community, about the environment that allowed anger to fester and pride to turn deadly. It is about the way modern disputes are no longer confined to whispers or private quarrels, but broadcast to hundreds, even thousands, amplifying every slight, every insult, every threat. Erica Reese and Katina Davis were products of this reality. Their feud was personal, but it was also public, and by the time Erica pressed that button to go live, the outcome was already set in motion. As the evening of May 1st approached, the words spoken earlier in the day hung in the air. On East Patton Avenue, neighbors would soon hear the sound of gunfire cutting through the ordinary rhythm of life. Within minutes, Erica would lie fatally wounded, and two others would be caught in the chaos. And as the news spread, Montgomery would be left asking how it had come to this. Stay with me as we move into the night of the crime itself, the moment when a feud that had burned online erupted into bloodshed on the streets of Montgomery. May 1st, 2022 began like any other day in Montgomery, Alabama. The sun rose over East Patton Avenue, where families moved through their routines, children playing in front yards, neighbors exchanging greetings, and the hum of everyday life carrying on without hint of what was to come. But for two women, this day was already heavy with tension. Words had been spoken, threats had been made, and by the time evening approached, fate was preparing to intervene. Earlier that day, 32-year-old Erica Reese had taken to Facebook Live. Her voice was defiant, her tone filled with anger. To her viewers, it may have sounded like yet another heated outburst, but for those who knew her and knew the situation, the words were loaded with meaning. Erica declared that she would end her rival, Katina Davis. She wanted the world to hear her conviction. That broadcast became the final note in a conflict that had been playing out in private conversations, public arguments, and online exchanges for weeks. As the hours passed, her words circulated, replayed, and repeated in the community. Social media, once again, had become a stage, not just for communication, but for escalation. Every insult and every vow of retaliation was magnified. Pride and reputation were now at stake, and neither woman was willing to back down. By evening, the neighborhood of East Patton Avenue was filled with a different kind of energy. For most, it was just another Sunday night. For Erica and Katina, it was the night everything would come to a head. Accounts from that night describe voices raised, tempers high, and the unmistakable sense that this was no longer just a war of words. Then it happened. Shots rang out. The quiet of the street was shattered by the sharp crack of gunfire. Witnesses later described chaos. people running, ducking for cover, the sound of screams mixing with the echo of bullets. In those few violent moments, everything changed. Erica Reese was struck and fell to the ground, fatally wounded. Two others who were nearby were also caught in the gunfire, injured in the eruption of violence that had stemmed from a feud they were not even central to. Neighbors rushed to call 911, their voices frantic, describing the scene of panic and devastation. When police and emergency responders arrived, they found Erica unresponsive. The attempts to save her life could not overcome the damage that had been done. She was pronounced dead, her final day ending not with reconciliation, but with blood on the pavement of East Patton Avenue. The news spread quickly. Word of Erica's death raced across Montgomery and soon across social media. The same platform where she had spoken her last public words became the stage where friends, family, and strangers reacted in shock and disbelief. For some, it was heartbreaking. For others, it was a grim reminder of how fragile life had become when disputes were carried beyond words. Investigators began piecing together what had happened. The name that surfaced again and again was the same one tied to Erica's final broadcast: Katina Davis. Witness accounts, evidence at the scene, and the history of threats pointed directly toward her. Within hours, law enforcement announced her arrest. She was charged with murder and assault, accused of being the one who fired the shots that ended Erica's life and injured two others. The crime shook Montgomery. It was not a random act. It was a tragedy that had grown from jealousy, pride, and anger. It was a reminder that the digital world and the real world were no longer separate, that a statement made for an audience online could carry deadly consequences in the streets. That night on East Patton Avenue remains etched in memory. A woman's life was lost, families were broken, and a community was left asking why words had to turn into bullets. Stay with me as we examine what happened next, the investigation that followed, the evidence that came to light, and the way law enforcement and the courts tried to bring clarity to a case born out of rage and rivalry. The gunfire on East Patton Avenue left behind more than just shattered glass and shell casings. It left behind questions that demanded answers. Within minutes of the shooting, Montgomery police had secured the area, cordoning off the street with yellow tape as flashing lights illuminated the night. Residents stood outside their homes, shaken and whispering about what they had seen. Some pointed toward where Erica Reese had fallen. Others spoke of the heated feud that had preceded the violence. The task for investigators was now clear: determine exactly what had happened and who was responsible. The first step was documenting the scene. Officers moved carefully, photographing evidence and marking the locations where shell casings lay scattered across the pavement. Bloodstains on the road told the story of where Erica collapsed, while the cries of wounded survivors revealed the sheer chaos of those moments. Forensics teams collected everything that could be used to reconstruct the shooting: ballistic evidence, witness recordings, even fragments from vehicles that had been struck. Nothing could be overlooked, because this was more than a crime. It was a public spectacle that had already gripped the community. Witnesses were brought forward, and their accounts began to weave together a timeline. Neighbors described seeing Erica in the hours before the shooting, still filled with the same determination she had broadcast earlier that day. Others recalled heated exchanges between her and Katina Davis, arguments that had become increasingly public. When the first shot rang out, some thought it was fireworks, but the reality quickly sank in as Erica fell to the ground and screams filled the night air. Investigators turned next to the digital trail. Erica's Facebook Live video was reviewed, her words analyzed line by line. It was not just background, it was a crucial piece of evidence showing the intensity of the conflict and the seriousness of the threats exchanged. Social media had documented the feud almost in real time, making the investigators' task both clearer and more disturbing. It did not take long for the focus to shift firmly onto one person: Katina Davis. Her name surfaced again and again, tied to the feud, tied to the threats, and tied to the scene itself. Police pieced together her movements that day, interviewing those who had seen her, and building a case that suggested she was the one who fired the fatal shots. The arrest came swiftly. Within hours of Erica's death, law enforcement announced that Katina had been taken into custody. She faced charges of murder for the death of Erica Reese and assault for the injuries inflicted on the two bystanders. The seriousness of the charges was matched by the weight of the community's outrage. For Erica's family, the arrest was a small step toward justice, but it did not ease the pain of their loss. At first, Katina's bond was set at $1.5 million, a figure reflecting the severity of the crime and the fear that she could pose a danger if released. Yet in a move that stirred controversy, the bond was later reduced to $150,000. For many, this was a shocking decision, one that felt like a betrayal to the memory of Erica and to the families of those injured. The reduction sparked conversations across Montgomery about fairness, accountability, and the weight of justice when measured against human life. The investigation continued even after the arrest. Prosecutors worked to strengthen their case, preparing for the courtroom battle that would follow. Every piece of evidence mattered: ballistics linking the weapon to the crime, eyewitness testimony describing Katina's presence and Erica's own words, preserved online, foreshadowing the violence that would end her life. For Montgomery, the investigation became more than just a police matter. It became a reflection of the times, a reminder of how personal disputes, when made public and amplified, could explode into tragedy. Parents spoke to their children about the dangers of online threats. Neighbors whispered about how quickly pride could turn deadly, and families mourned, not only for Erica, but for the community that had been left scarred. The case against Katina Davis was set to move from the streets to the courtroom, but for those who had witnessed the shooting, for those who had replayed Erica's final words on social media, and for those who had lost her forever, the investigation had already revealed a painful truth. No feud, no relationship, no rivalry was worth the price that had been paid. Stay with me as we step into the courtroom itself, where the battle for justice unfolded, where attorneys fought to prove guilt or innocence, and where the community waited for answers that might never feel complete. When the courtroom doors finally opened for the case of State of Alabama versus Katina Davis, the air was heavy with anticipation. Reporters lined the steps outside, cameras flashing, while family members of both the victim and the accused filled the benches inside. For many, this trial was not just about one act of violence. It was about the consequences of a feud carried too far, about the power of words spoken in anger, and about justice for a mother whose life had ended too soon. The prosecution began with a simple, direct argument. Katina Davis had fired the shots that killed 32-year-old Erica Reese and injured two others. They painted a picture of a deliberate act, fueled by rage and jealousy, rooted in the very public feud between the two women. They reminded the jury of Erica's Facebook Live broadcast on the morning of May 1, 2022, a broadcast that laid bare the animosity between them. The prosecution argued that this was not just an exchange of threats, it was the prelude to murder. Witnesses were called to the stand. Neighbors described the chaos on East Patton Avenue, the sound of gunfire breaking through the night, and the horrifying sight of Erica collapsing onto the pavement. Survivors who had been wounded in the shooting testified about the suddenness of the attack, their voices heavy with emotion as they recalled how quickly a normal evening turned into horror. Law enforcement officers detailed their investigation, walking the jury through ballistic reports, forensic evidence, and the digital trail that had led them to Katina. The defense countered with a different narrative. Their argument centered on doubt. They suggested that the confrontation had escalated in ways that were not clear, that Katina's role was less certain than the prosecution claimed, and that the state had built its case on assumptions fueled by social media noise. They questioned witness reliability, pointing out the chaos of the moment and the difficulty of identifying the shooter with certainty amid the panic. Their goal was not necessarily to prove Katina innocent, but to introduce enough uncertainty to sway the jury. One of the most intense moments of the trial came when the Facebook Live recording was replayed in court. Erica's words, spoken just hours before her death, echoed through the courtroom. For the jury, for the families, and for the community, it was a haunting reminder of how quickly life can change. The prosecution argued that these words showed the seriousness of the feud. The defense countered that words, no matter how heated, did not prove who pulled the trigger. The issue of bond reduction also resurfaced during the proceedings. Initially set at $1.5 million, Katina's bond had been lowered to $150,000, sparking outrage from Erica's family and supporters. In court, prosecutors emphasized how this decision reflected a troubling leniency in the face of such a violent act. It became part of the broader narrative about justice and accountability, questions that extended far beyond the trial itself. Day after day, testimony continued, evidence was presented, and both sides fought to shape the story that the jury would believe. Outside the courthouse, the community followed every update, debating not just Katina's guilt, but the larger issue of how conflicts fueled online could erupt into bloodshed on city streets. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom fell silent. Katina Davis was found guilty of murder and assault. For Erica's family, it was a measure of justice, though no verdict could bring her back. Tears flowed as the reality settled in. One life ended, another condemned to prison, and countless others left scarred by the feud that had torn their world apart. The sentencing solidified the weight of the decision. The judge spoke of the reckless disregard for human life, of the dangers of allowing anger to dictate action, and of the community's need for closure. For many in Montgomery, this moment marked the end of one chapter, but the beginning of reflection. How could such a tragedy have been prevented, and what lessons could be drawn from the ashes it left behind? The trial of Katina Davis became more than a courtroom battle. It became a story carried across headlines and social media, a reminder of the fragile line between words and violence, and a call for change in how conflicts are addressed before they reach the point of no return. Stay with me as we look at what came after the verdict, the aftermath for families, the conversations it sparked in Montgomery, and the lasting questions about jealousy, pride, and the dangers of living our lives in the public glare of social media. After the verdict was delivered, the emotional ripple effect extended far beyond the courthouse walls. For Erica Reese's family, justice had been served, but the victory was bittersweet. They left the courtroom clutching photographs of Erica, speaking through tears about the daughter, sister, and mother they had lost. "No sentence will ever bring her back," one family member said, "but at least now we know her death was not in vain." Their grief remained, but there was a small measure of peace in knowing that the legal system had acknowledged the gravity of what happened. For Katina Davis, the weight of the guilty verdict was crushing. Once a familiar figure in Montgomery's tight-knit neighborhoods, she was now branded as a murderer. Shackled and led out of the courtroom, her face betrayed a mixture of shock and resignation. Her supporters, some of whom had stood by her side throughout the trial, were left divided, some still clinging to the belief that the evidence was circumstantial, while others quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the violent outcome of a feud that spiraled out of control. In Montgomery, the trial had become more than just a legal proceeding. It had sparked conversations across the city. Parents and community leaders began speaking openly about the dangers of online feuds, especially those fueled by platforms like Facebook Live. Erica's final broadcast became a grim case study in how public disputes could escalate into real-life tragedy. Churches held vigils, not only to honor Erica's memory, but also to urge young people to resist the pull of public confrontation and learn the value of walking away before words turned deadly. The case also reignited debates about the role of the justice system. Many questioned why Katina's bond had been reduced so drastically, from $1.5 million to $150,000, despite the severity of the charges. Some saw it as a loophole in a system too lenient on violent offenders. Others argued that bond decisions were complicated, tied to legal precedents and judicial discretion. But for Erica's family and supporters, the reduction was a deep wound, a moment when it seemed her life had been undervalued. As weeks turned into months after the trial, the story of Erica Reese and Katina Davis lingered in the headlines. Journalists revisited the case during anniversaries of the tragedy, while true crime enthusiasts dissected the feud, the evidence, and the verdict. Erica's name became a reminder of how pride and jealousy, when fueled by public spectacle, could leave irreversible scars on families and communities. For Montgomery, the tragedy was a wake-up call. In the aftermath, both grief and reflection remained, an acknowledgement that justice had been delivered, but at a cost so high it could never be measured in years or sentences. In the weeks that followed the trial, Montgomery continued to grapple with the weight of what had happened. Conversations in barbershops, church gatherings, and family dinners always seemed to circle back to one central question. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Many pointed to the warning signs: Erica's Facebook Live threats, the heated back-and-forth exchanges, and the very public nature of the feud. Friends recalled trying to calm her down, urging her to step away, but their words had gone unheard. Others wondered if law enforcement could have intervened earlier, given the threats were made so openly online. These questions had no easy answers, but they echoed through the community like a wound that refused to close. At the same time, the aftermath revealed the long-term damage inflicted on those closest to the case. Erica's children faced the heartbreaking reality of growing up without their mother, left only with memories and photographs to remind them of her smile. Her family did everything they could to provide stability, but no matter how much love surrounded them, the absence was undeniable. The echoes of gunfire on East Patton Avenue had not just taken a life, they had altered the course of an entire family's future. For Katina Davis, life behind bars became her new reality. Once known for her strong personality and sharp words, she was now confined to the quiet routine of prison life, surrounded not by friends and rivals, but by steel doors and correctional officers. Reports from inside suggested she spent much of her time alone, reflecting on the choices that brought her there. Supporters who once filled court benches slowly faded away, unwilling to stand by someone found guilty of murder. Her story served as a reminder that a moment of rage can destroy not just a rival, but one's own future as well. The city itself carried scars. East Patton Avenue, once an ordinary street, became synonymous with tragedy. Neighbors who had heard the gunfire that night spoke of sleepless evenings, haunted by the memory of chaos and sirens. The incident had shaken their sense of safety, reminding them how quickly violence could erupt close to home. Some even chose to move away, unable to bear the constant reminders of what had happened. Community leaders attempted to transform the tragedy into a lesson. Local pastors organized forums addressing conflict resolution, while schools introduced discussions on the dangers of online disputes. Erica's story was used as a case study for youth programs, showing how pride and public threats could escalate to irreversible outcomes. The message was simple yet urgent. Words matter, and once spoken, they cannot always be taken back. As the months rolled on, the memory of Erica Reese remained present in Montgomery. Her family's grief became the city's warning. The feud that began with jealousy and ended with gunfire was no longer just a story about two women. It was a story about the consequences of unchecked anger and the fragile line between words and violence.